If you are joining us right now, I want you to take a quick mental inventory of your own kitchen.
Yeah, just picture it.
Seriously, just close your eyes and picture the shelves in your pantry or, the inside of your refrigerator.
Right.
You probably have some all-purpose flour sitting there, maybe a bag of white sugar, some canned vegetables, a bag of rice.
And almost certainly some coffee.
Oh, for sure. Coffee is a given.
Mm.
And we interact with these items every single day, right? We reach for them while we're half awake in the morning. And we almost never stop to think about the invisible historical architecture that put them there.
No, we don't.
So today, we are going on a journey to discover how the very contents of your pantry, these ingredients that you consider just absolute staples of daily life, are directly connected to global histories of power, resilience, and systemic transformation.
It is a profoundly complex web to trace once you really start looking closely at it. Because we tend to view food merely as, fuel for our bodies.
You're right, or just comfort.
Exactly, like a cultural comfort or a family tradition. But we rarely examine a plate of food as a historical document.
A historical document.
I like that.
Yeah.
When you actually trace the lineage of that bag of sugar or that cup of coffee, you are tracing the history of human migration, the expansion of empires, and, frankly, the profound alteration of global ecosystems.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring this movement that's known as decolonizing food.
Right.
And I want to set the parameters right up front because I think the phrase can sometimes be misunderstood.
Oh, absolutely. It gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, this isn't just about changing what is on a restaurant menu or launching some trendy new diet plan. It is fundamentally about reclaiming land, restoring human health, securing economic independence, and ensuring cultural survival.
It's all of the above.
It is. And we're drawing on a deeply researched foundation of texts today. We're examining case studies, historical analyses, and indigenous frameworks that span the entire globe.
From the Pacific Northwest to the African diaspora.
Right, exactly. Now, just a quick note for you listening. Our sources do contain references to politically charged situations.
Right, like modern agricultural realities in politically contested regions.
Yes, like Palestinian olive groves under occupation or specific U.S. presidential administrations freezing Native American tribal funds. And we are just impartially exploring these concepts exactly as they are presented by the authors of our sources.
Right, we're not endorsing any political side here. We are just looking at the case studies to understand the systemic mechanisms.
Exactly. We just want to see how these systems function. Because looking at those specific case studies, it moves the whole concept of a food system out of the abstract.
Yeah, into the real lived experiences of actual communities. We are reading the landscape exactly as the scholars, the researchers, and the communities themselves have mapped it out.
Right.
We want to understand the underlying mechanisms, like how does a food system actually function as a tool of governance? And conversely, how can it function as a tool of liberation?
So let's start right at the foundation, well beyond the dinner plate itself. When we use the phrase colonial food system, we need to define what we're actually looking at.
Yeah, we have to define our terms.
Because I think the common sort of simplified assumption that we're all taught in grade school is just the Columbian Exchange.
Oh, right, the old textbook narrative.
Yeah. We are taught that Europeans brought wheat, apples, and cows to new places, and they took potatoes, corn, and tomatoes back with them.
A simple, friendly trade.
Right? A relatively benign swapping of agricultural goods. But the research paints a picture of a far more systemic, intentional, and often, destructive structural overhaul, doesn't it?
It was an entirely different scale of transformation than just a simple exchange of goods.
Yep.
The historical record demonstrates that colonization was never merely about introducing new crops. It was a complete structural reorganization of life.
How so?
Well, it involved the explicit seizure of land, widespread ecological destruction, and the intentional and really calculated suppression of traditional agricultural knowledge. Yeah. Colonial governments systematically reorganized food production in conquered territories to serve distant imperial markets rather than the local communities who actually lived on the land.
So it was a forced shift. From a localized system designed to feed a community to a monoculture system designed to feed an export economy.
Precisely. You had these diverse, highly adapted systems of farming, fishing, hunting, and foraging.
Systems that have been around forever.
Right, refined over thousands of years to work in harmony with specific local ecosystems, and those were legally restricted or just completely eradicated.
And replaced by what?
They were replaced by plantation economies, cash crops, and industrial agriculture. And simultaneously, you see the psychological component.
What do you mean?
Traditional foods were often aggressively stigmatized by the colonizing culture as being primitive or dirty or nutritionally deficient.
Which is deeply ironic, because the historical research points out how colonial societies routinely adopted, commercialized, and profited from the very agricultural knowledge developed by the communities they were actively marginalizing.
It is a striking contradiction, yeah. And we have to understand that this wasn't just like an accidental side effect of expanding empires. Food was actively and purposefully utilized as a weapon of conquest and control.
As a weapon.
Yes, historical governments purposefully destroyed crops.
Right.
We see this with the scorched earth tactics used against indigenous communities globally.
Right.
They slaughtered culturally significant animals, and they passed strict laws restricting hunting and fishing access. They would intentionally withhold supplies or destroy a local food base to force communities off their ancestral lands.
To create dependency.
Exactly. By doing so, they intentionally created a reliance on government rations and imported heavily processed goods.
Let me pose a thought experiment to really ground what this feels like for the listener, because reading about it in a historical text can feel a bit, distant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Imagine someone comes into your home right now. They change the locks on your kitchen door so you can't get in. They pave over your backyard vegetable garden with solid concrete. And then they hand you a cardboard box full of highly processed, shelf-stable rations.
Right.
And after doing all of that, they claim that they have generously solved your hunger problem.
Which is absurd.
Exactly. You might technically have enough calories in that box to survive the week, but you have absolute zero control over your own survival.
Yeah.
You are entirely dependent on the person who holds the key to the box.
That analogy perfectly captures the distinction between two crucial concepts that dominate this field of research:
Which are?
food security versus food sovereignty.
Okay, let's break those down.
So food security, in the conventional institutional sense, is exactly what you just described with the box of rations.
Yeah.
It generally asks a very limited question. Do people have enough calories to avoid literal starvation?
So it's just about the numbers.
Yes, it is a metric of basic caloric intake. It doesn't necessarily ask where the food came from, what nutritional value it actually holds, who produced it, or who controls the supply chain.
It just asks, is there food in the box, and did you eat it?
Yeah, that's it. If a community is entirely reliant on emergency aid shipments of, say, processed flour and refined sugar, they might be classified as food secure on paper simply because they aren't starving.
Wow.
Food sovereignty, however, fundamentally shifts the paradigm to self-determination. It asks the deeper questions.
Like who holds the keys?
Exactly. Who controls the land? Who controls the methods of production? Who makes the decisions about what is grown and how it is distributed?
Right.
Indigenous food sovereignty asserts the inherent right of communities to control their own food systems according to their own cultures, their own laws, and their own reciprocal relationships with the natural world.
It's a totally different worldview.
It really is. It rejects the premise that food is merely a commodity to be bought and sold on a global market. Instead, it views food as a living network of relationships between people, plants, animals, water, and future generations.
Okay, so if we go back to the idea of being locked out of your own kitchen, to reclaim that space, to rip up the concrete in the backyard and start growing again, you first need the physical keys to the system.
You do.
And in the context of food sovereignty, the physical keys to the agricultural kitchen are seeds and land.
The foundational elements.
Right. So let's dive into seeds first, because the language the researchers use here is very specific and highly intentional. They don't just talk about seed saving, which is, a term you hear a lot in modern gardening circles.
Right.
Talk about seed rematriation.
Yes, rematriation. It is a vital and deeply significant term here. We often hear the word repatriation when discussing the return of stolen museum artifacts or human remains to their home countries.
Sure.
But rematriation specifically refers to returning ancestral seeds to their originating communities. And it carries a distinctly feminine, relational, and life-giving connotation.
Because in many indigenous cultures across the globe, seed keeping, the rigorous scientific process of selecting and preserving the best seeds for the next generation, that was traditionally The responsibility and domain of women, correct?
Exactly. Women were the agricultural scientists.
Oh.
They were selecting for drought tolerance, flavor, and yield over centuries. And the concept of rematriation contrasts sharply with the modern Western commercial view of seeds.
Also.
Well, in the industrial agricultural model, seeds are treated strictly as intellectual property. They are patented.
Patented seeds, right.
They are often genetically modified to terminate after one generation. These are the so-called suicide seeds.
Wait, suicide seeds?
Yeah, they are engineered so that farmers cannot save them, and they are legally forced to buy new stock from a corporation every single year.
That is wild. I think a good way to understand this is to compare it to, like software licensing.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. When you buy a commercial seed today, you don't really own the genetic code of that plant. You're essentially just renting the license to use it for one growing season.
Yes, you're just renting it.
But the indigenous framework views seeds not as lines of proprietary code, but as living relatives.
That is a profound philosophical difference. If a seed is a relative, it holds the memory of the soil, the climate, and the people who tended it.
It has a history.
Exactly. One of the case studies that illustrates this beautifully is the Nkajuppi project.
Oh, right, the Nkajuppi project.
The research details how 4 Sisseton Wahpeton Dakota women are actively engaged in reviving ancestral seeds, establishing community gardens, and restoring traditional plant knowledge.
And it's a huge undertaking.
It is. The process is rigorous. They aren't just casually tossing seeds into the dirt. They're tracking down heritage varieties that have been locked away in university vaults or kept alive by isolated families. When they plant these seeds, they are quite literally bringing their relatives home. They are restoring biological diversity to the soil and facilitating cultural renewal simultaneously.
But you cannot talk about returning seeds without talking about the soil they are destined for. Land justice is the absolute bedrock of food sovereignty.
Without land, you have nothing.
Right. A community cannot exercise control over its food system without secure, meaningful access to farmland, forests, rivers, and traditional gathering places. And this requires a fundamental shift in how land itself is perceived by the legal system, doesn't it?
It does. Land-back movements challenge the prevailing Western notion of land strictly as an economic asset, a piece of real estate to be exploited for maximum yield.
Right, just property.
Instead, the framework is one of a reciprocal relationship. You care for the land, and in turn, the land cares for you.
And this brings us to a fascinating legal frontier that the sources mention: the rights of nature. It fundamentally alters the architecture of environmental protection and agricultural policy. A prime example in the text is the legal battle surrounding manoomin, or wild rice.
Manoomin, yes, that's a huge one.
For the Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes region, manoomin is not just a carbohydrate source.
Yeah.
It is a sacred food, a living relative, and a resource explicitly protected by historical treaties.
Right.
In northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, the Bad River Band and other tribes are fighting to protect manoomin from severe existential threats. Things like climate change, agricultural runoff, and the construction of oil pipelines through their watersheds.
And the legal mechanics of this are really what's groundbreaking here.
Yeah, I want to dig into that because if wild rice is just legally classified as a crop or property, a fossil fuel corporation might argue that if a pipeline leaks, they can just write a check to financially compensate the tribe for the lost property value of the harvest.
Exactly. The damage is treated as just a financial transaction.
Right.
That is exactly how standard property law functions. But researchers and tribal legal scholars are partnering to establish the actual legal and cultural personhood of the manoomin plant.
Personhood for a plant.
Yes. If the plant has rights of nature, if it is recognized as a legal entity with the right to exist, flourish, and regenerate, you cannot just pay a retroactive fine for destroying its habitat.
It's completely different.
It is akin to the concept of corporate personhood, where a corporation is granted certain rights under the law. If a corporation can be a person, these scholars argue, why not a sacred, life-sustaining plant?
So how does that play out in a courtroom? Like, does it actually hold water in the Western legal system?
It is actively being tested, and it shifts the entire burden of proof. When a tribe sues on behalf of manoomin, the plant itself is essentially the plaintiff.
That is wild. The plant is the plaintiff.
Yeah. It forces the courts and the regulatory agencies to evaluate ecological harm, not just as a loss of human property, but as a violation of the plant's inherent right to survive. It elevates the standard of ecological care from mere resource management to a profound legal obligation.
That is a staggering shift in perspective. And this reciprocal relationship isn't just about legally protecting a space and leaving it untouched, right? It is about active, intentional human stewardship.
Absolutely.
The Jamestown Sklallam tribe in the Pacific Northwest provides a perfect example of this. They are working to restore camas prairies.
Yes, camas.
Camas is a culturally vital wildflower with a highly nutritious edible bulb. And they aren't restoring it by, putting a tall chain link fence around a field and walking away to let nature take its course.
No, not at all.
They are actively utilizing traditional controlled burning.
The mechanism of controlled burning is vital to understand here. By intentionally setting low-intensity fires at specific times of the year, they clear out invasive species,
Right here.
they return essential nutrients to the soil, and they create the exact ecological conditions that the camas bulbs need to thrive.
It completely upends the modern conservationist idea that all human intervention in nature is inherently destructive.
Oh, completely.
In this framework, human beings are a necessary, beneficial component of the ecosystem. We are supposed to be active partners in the landscape.
And when you recognize that human beings can act as a keystone species, actively cultivating biodiversity, you see how these localized community efforts naturally ripple out to heal the broader environment.
Right. It's all connected.
The research makes a compelling, scientifically backed argument. Ecological restoration is food system restoration. You cannot separate the two. They form a mutually beneficial, inseparable cycle.
Okay, let's examine how this applies to animal populations, because the restoration of the buffalo to the Great Plains is one of the most striking examples of this interconnectedness in the sources.
Yeah, the buffalo.
We're seeing large-scale transfers of buffalo herds returning to native nations. But the impact goes far beyond just having these animals physically present on the grass again. The real leverage lies in how they are legally classified.
Yes, this is fascinating. The Eastern Shoshone tribe in Wyoming made a highly strategic and critical decision regarding their returning herds.
What do they do?
They chose to legally classify buffalo under their jurisdiction as wildlife rather than livestock.
Let's pause there, because to a layperson, buffalo is a buffalo. Why does that bureaucratic distinction between wildlife and livestock matter so much on the ground?
It changes every single aspect of how the animal interacts with the land.
Really?
Yeah. Think about it. The term livestock implies commercial property destined for industrial processing. If a buffalo is livestock, it falls under standard agricultural law.
Right.
That dictates how the animals must be fenced in, what they are fed, how they are vaccinated, and it limits their movement to prevent interaction with other commercial cattle.
It treats them like cows.
Exactly. By legally classifying them as wildlife, the tribe shifts the entire paradigm from commercial agriculture to ecological management.
So what does a buffalo do as wildlife that it can't do as livestock?
As wildlife, the buffalo are allowed to roam and interact with the prairie ecosystem as they have for millennia.
Oh,
Their grazing patterns naturally aerate the soil. Their wallows, the shallow depressions they create by rolling in the dirt,
Yeah.
those capture rainwater and create microhabitats for specific prairie amphibians and insects. Their presence supports the return of native bird species.
Wow, so they are terraforming the prairie.
They are. By rejecting the livestock model, the tribe is fundamentally restoring the health of the soil while simultaneously reviving tribal economies and ceremonial life that revolve around the buffalo. It is a profound act of sovereignty over both their food supply and their local ecology.
We see a very similar, highly contested dynamic regarding water rights and salmon populations.
Yes.
It takes these detail the decades-long and ultimately successful campaign by the Karuk and Yurok tribes to mandate the removal of massive hydroelectric dams on the Klamath River, spanning California and Oregon.
A huge undertaking.
For a century, these dams completely blocked the migration routes and devastated the salmon populations, which were the undisputed lifeblood of the tribe's diet, their economy, and their spiritual life.
The Klamath Dam removal is a watershed moment, literally and figuratively. The tribe's fight to remove the dams masterfully blended the assertion of their historical treaty rights with a demand for basic ecological survival.
Right.
They recognized that you simply cannot have a sovereign food system if the river that sustains it is choked by concrete and toxic algae blooms caused by stagnant water.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a moment.
Yeah.
When we talk about removing major hydroelectric dams, we are talking about dismantling infrastructure that provides electricity and irrigation separation from modern agriculture.
Oh, absolutely.
How do these movements balance sovereign food rights against the very real modern demands for energy and infrastructure? Like, does the assertion of traditional food rights just automatically trump modern economic developments?
It is a critical tension, and the legal battles were fierce precisely because of those competing interests.
I can imagine.
But the tribes, along with environmental scientists, were able to demonstrate that the dams were not just destroying the salmon, they were fundamentally degrading the entire watershed.
Which hurts everyone.
Exactly, which eventually harms everyone, including the agricultural interests downstream. Furthermore, the dams were aging and becoming economically unviable to maintain or upgrade to modern environmental standards.
So they were already failing.
Yes. The tribes successfully argued that the long-term ecological and economic health of the entire region depended on a free-flowing river.
Right.
Restoring the salmon doesn't just benefit the tribes. It strengthens the entire river ecosystem, improves water quality, and restores community health practices that were severed by the dams.
And when you zoom out and connect this to the macro level, how do these specific, localized traditional food practices function as broader, global climate strategies?
What becomes immediately apparent in the research is the stark vulnerability of our current system.
The industrial system.
Yeah. Industrial agriculture relies heavily on massive monocropping, planting thousands of acres of a single genetically uniform crop.
Like just miles of corn.
Right. This approach is incredibly brittle. It is highly vulnerable to climate shocks, sudden droughts, and novel diseases. To sustain it, you need heavy, continuous inputs of chemical fertilizers and pesticides.
It's propped up artificially.
Exactly. Indigenous food systems, conversely, are inherently biodiverse.
Can you give a specific example of what that biodiversity looks like in practice?
A classic example is the Haudenosaunee practice of planting the Three Sisters.
The Three Sisters, right.
Corn, beans, and squash grown together in the same mound.
Okay, how does that work?
The corn provides a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil to fertilize the corn.
Oh, wow.
And the broad leaves of the squash shade the ground, retaining moisture and preventing weeds. It is a deeply complex, self-sustaining microecosystem.
That's brilliant.
When you cultivate diverse varieties of plants, or when you restore a complex habitat like a salmon river, you build inherent resilience. A biodiverse system is far more capable of adapting to a changing, volatile climate than a monoculture field.
Right.
Therefore, these food sovereignty movements are not just about cultural preservation. They are active, frontline climate adaptation strategies.
And there is a direct, undeniable link here. Healing the land and the water has a one-to-one correlation with healing the human body.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the health perspectives of this movement, specifically the concept of decolonizing diet and medicine. We have to address the very real, very present health crisis context here.
It is an unavoidable and critical piece of the puzzle. When public health officials look at many indigenous and marginalized communities globally, they see disproportionately high rates of severe chronic diseases.
Like what?
Type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and obesity. And for a very long time, the dominant mainstream medical narrative framed this almost exclusively as a failure of individual behavior.
Right, blaming the patient.
The assumption was that these communities just needed better education on nutrition or that they were making poor lifestyle choices.
But the foundational texts we are examining completely and forcefully reject that framing.
Absolutely. The epidemiological and historical research demonstrates clearly that this localized health crisis is the direct physiological result of historical land loss and the forced dietary transition we discussed earlier.
From the rations.
Yes. When communities were violently pushed off their ancestral land, confined to reservations, or geographically isolated from their traditional hunting and foraging grounds, they lost access to the highly nutritious, locally cultivated foods their bodies had adapted to over millennia.
So they were cut off from their actual nutrition.
Exactly. To survive, they were forced to rely on government commodity programs and cheap imported food.
So instead of lean game meats, complex wild carbohydrates, and diverse plant nutrients, they were given white flour, refined cane sugar, lard, and high-sodium canned meats.
Exactly. These replacement diets are overwhelmingly high in refined carbohydrates, sodium, and unhealthy fats, and completely devoid of the micronutrients found in traditional diets.
It makes me think about how we process trauma. If a person experiences a sudden, violent disruption in their living situation, we expect them to exhibit signs of stress.
Right.
What we're talking about here is systemic dietary trauma inflicted on a population level over generations. The human body is reacting exactly as one would expect when subjected to a sudden, radical shift in its nutritional environment.
That is a very accurate physiological assessment. And this is why Dr. Rupamaria's concept of deep medicine, which is heavily featured in the literature, is so relevant.
Deep medicine, okay.
She argues that we need a structural approach to healing. Our current medical model is highly reactive.
How so?
If a patient has severe inflammation or diabetes, we prescribe medication to manage the symptoms. But Dr. Maria argues that you cannot just medicate the inflammation. You have to address the structural colonial root cause of that inflammation,
Which is the diet itself.
which is the violent disruption of the food system itself. True health equity requires restoring the broken relationships between communities, their lands, and their ancestral foods.
We are seeing this concept of structural healing being put into action through education, particularly focusing on the next generation. The Umaho Nation Public School in Nebraska is highlighted as a remarkably powerful case study.
Oh, yes, that's a great example.
They recognize that you can't just hand a kid a pamphlet about healthy eating.
Yeah.
They fully integrated culturally relevant farming and traditional meals directly into the school's daily curriculum.
The mechanics of what they are doing are deeply impressive. They aren't just teaching a generic agriculture class.
Right.
The students are actively cultivating traditional umoho crops. They are learning the specific agricultural science of their ancestors. And the food they grow goes directly into the school cafeteria to feed the student body.
What kind of tangible outcomes are researchers documenting from this kind of program?
The outcomes go far beyond basic nutrition. The research documents a substantial increase in youth confidence and a profound strengthening of cultural identity.
Really?
Yeah. When students participate in growing the food of their ancestors and when they hear their traditional language being spoken while working in the soil, it actively heals the psychological and physical disconnect caused by generations of colonization.
Wow.
It lowers stress markers, it improves attendance and engagement. It is a holistic form of medicine.
We see a parallel movement in the Decolonize Your Diet initiative, which focuses heavily on the Mexican-American and Chicano experience.
Yes.
This movement is doing the vital work of reviving plant-based pre-colonial recipes. They are intentionally centering ingredients like nopales, the edible cactus paddles amaranth, chayote squash, jicama, and diverse varieties of beans and corn.
Right, the traditional staple.
Because these were the absolute nutritional staples of Mesoamerica long before the Spanish conquest introduced, massive amounts of beef, dairy, wheat, and refined sugar into the regional diet.
And this movement is highly strategic. It is doing much more than just publishing interesting cookbooks.
What else are they doing?
It is actively pushing back against the deeply embedded colonial assumptions within modern institutional dietetics education.
Okay, wait, explain that.
Well, for decades, the standard nutritional guidelines taught in universities elevated European dietary habits as the universal baseline for human health.
Like the food pyramid.
Exactly like the food pyramid. The heavy reliance on dairy for calcium or specific ratios of meat to vegetables.
While simultaneously marginalizing traditional diets as somehow lacking or inherently less healthy.
Precisely. Decolonizing dietetics means forcing the medical and nutritional establishment to recognize that ancestral foodways provide complete, highly sophisticated nutritional profiles.
Right.
The combination of corn, beans, and squash, for example, provides a complete protein profile. These diets are biologically suited to the people who developed them over thousands of years, and recognizing that is a crucial step in combating the chronic disease epidemic.
So, while the devastating health impacts of colonialism are a universal theme across all the populations studied in our sources, the specific on-the-ground strategies for reclaiming economic and land sovereignty look very different depending on the geography and the unique historical trauma of the people.
They absolutely do.
Let's shift our focus to compare two distinct geographic spheres that the research highlights: the movements in the Pacific and those within the African diaspora.
Examining these two spheres side by side offers a brilliant study in how the concept of food sovereignty is highly adaptable.
It's not one size fits all.
Exactly. It molds itself to specific historical contexts and ecological realities. Both regions are fundamentally fighting the enduring structural legacies of colonial land dispossession, but their methods and immediate priorities are shaped by their distinct environments.
Let's examine the Pacific movements first. We're looking at Native Hawaiian initiatives, the Maori and Aotearoa in New Zealand, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia. The strategic focus here leans heavily into preserving island ecology, securing water rights, and building disaster resilience. Right?
Yes, because the geography demands it. In Hawaii, for example, the historical context is defined by the plantation economies,
Like sugar.
primarily sugar and pineapple cartels. These operations monopolized the land and, crucially, diverted the natural water flows for over a century.
Wow.
This environmental manipulation made the islands dangerously dependent on imported foods, heavily reliant on shipping lanes.
Which is dangerous for an island.
Very dangerous. Today, native Hawaiian food sovereignty efforts are aggressively focused on restoring the lui kalo, the traditional wetland terraces used to grow taro,
Right.
as well as propagating breadfruit trees and rebuilding the ancient, highly engineered coastal fish ponds that once provided abundant, sustainable protein.
The research specifically highlights how these traditional sovereign food systems are playing a vital, immediate role right now in the recovery efforts following the devastating Maui wildfires.
Yes, they are.
Instead of waiting for or relying solely on federal emergency aid or imported canned goods, local community networks are leaning on traditional agriculture. They are distributing local taro and harvesting breadfruit to feed displaced residents.
It's incredible to see.
It is a deliberate strategic move to rebuild their food system from the ground up, reducing their dangerous vulnerability to external supply chain disruptions and the tourism industry.
And we see a similar profound connection to the physical land in Maori approaches to kai, or food sovereignty in New Zealand.
Kai sovereignty.
Right. The researchers explicitly link modern Maori food insecurity directly to the historical loss of Wenua the land.
So it's tied directly to the land.
Yes. The argument is that food insecurity in these communities is not simply an issue of not having a grocery store nearby.
Yeah.
It is the deliberate legal restriction of customary harvesting rights.
Oh, I see.
It is the marginalization of the traditional knowledge required to safely forage, fish, and cultivate in their ancestral territories.
And what about in Australia?
For Aboriginal communities in Australia, the movement is deeply tied to protecting country. It is about ensuring that the booming, lucrative commercial interest in Australian native ingredients like kakadu plum or finger lime doesn't once again exclude Indigenous peoples from ownership, management, and economic benefit.
Now, if we cross the globe and contrast that with the African diaspora movements, the historical context shifts. It isn't solely about the theft of ancestral land. It is fundamentally about the brutal legacy of global plantation economies, the transatlantic slave trade, and forced labor.
This is a crucial distinction, and this is where the rigorous historical research of geographer Judith Carney is so pivotal.
Yes, her work is fascinating.
She details how enslaved Africans, despite facing unimaginably brutal, dehumanizing conditions, managed to preserve seeds and complex agricultural knowledge from their homelands.
Right, they weren't just blank slates.
Exactly. They didn't arrive as empty vessels, they arrived as skilled agriculturalists.
How did they actually manage to preserve that knowledge and those seeds under a system of total surveillance and violent control?
Through sheer resilience and subversion. Enslaved women famously braided seeds of rice, okra, and millet into their hair before surviving the Middle Passage.
Braided into their hair. That is profound.
It is. And once on the plantations, they utilized provision grounds.
What were provision grounds?
They were small, marginal plots of land they were sometimes permitted to cultivate, usually on Sundays, simply to grow enough food for their own survival, because the plantation owners provided bare minimum rations.
So in these tiny, overlooked patches of dirt, they were essentially preserving an entire botanical, culinary, and agricultural heritage entirely under the radar of the plantation economy.
Exactly. They were experimenting, adapting African crops to the American soil, and keeping their foodways alive. And that specific history of survival and subversion directly informs the strategies of modern Black food sovereignty movements today.
How so?
Well, today, these movements are confronting what activists and scholars refer to as food apartheid.
Let's define that term, because it is much more precise than the older term food desert.
Yes. A desert implies a naturally occurring phenomenon, like a geographic inevitability.
Right, like it just happened to be empty.
Exactly. Food apartheid recognizes that the unequal access to fresh, healthy food in Black and brown communities is not an accident of nature. It is a deliberately designed system resulting from decades of housing segregation, redlining, chronic disinvestment, and corporate supermarket consolidation.
So to combat a deliberately designed system of economic marginalization, The modern strategies are heavily focused on building cooperative economics.
Yes.
It is about establishing Black-led urban agriculture, creating mutual aid food distribution networks, and launching direct campaigns for land ownership and agricultural reparations.
If we synthesize the two spheres, Pacific movements heavily emphasize restoring fragile aquatic and island ecosystems to build climate and disaster resilience, drawing on unbroken, though suppressed, ties to a specific ancestral homeland. African diaspora movements, dealing with the trauma of displacement, emphasize overcoming the legacy of forced labor by reclaiming agricultural expertise and building cooperative, self-sustaining urban and rural economic networks.
Let me ask you a very practical question then. Because I can easily imagine a listener sitting in a high-rise apartment in Chicago or London, completely surrounded by concrete.
Sure.
They're hearing about restoring ancient fish ponds in Hawaii or securing rural farmland for cooperatives, and it sounds inspiring, but very distant. How does a city dweller, someone who has never grown a tomato in their life, relate to or actively support these localized sovereignty-based struggles?
It is a vital question, and it is a misconception that food sovereignty only happens in rural areas.
Really?
Yeah. Urban environments are deeply embedded in the global food supply chain. A city dweller has enormous leverage.
How so?
Supporting Black-led urban farming initiatives or participating in community-supported agriculture CSAs that intentionally source from historically marginalized farmers, those are direct acts of solidarity.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, advocating for municipal zoning policies that allow for community gardens on vacant city lots, or supporting policies that allow people to sell homegrown produce, shifts the legal landscape.
You can change the laws locally.
Exactly. As a consumer, every single dollar spent at a cooperative grocery store or a restaurant that sources ethically and locally is a conscious choice to divest from the industrial colonial food model.
Which perfectly sets up the final arena we need to explore. Because this reclaiming of autonomy isn't just happening in academic policy meetings, tribal courts, or distant farm fields. It is vividly alive right now in modern kitchens, innovative restaurants, and across food media, the culinary front line.
The culinary revival we are witnessing right now is extraordinary. Indigenous chefs, cooks, authors, and food educators are rapidly becoming the most visible, accessible leaders in the movement to decolonize food.
They are the face of it.
They are translating complex historical theories into tangible, visceral experiences on the plate.
And one of the most prominent celebrated examples in our sources is Chef Sean Sherman and his restaurant Owamni, located in Minneapolis.
Owamni. Yep.
What they are doing is considered radical, not necessarily because of what they cook, but because of what they intentionally reject. They have removed colonial ingredients entirely from their menu.
It is a profound culinary constraint that breeds immense creativity. They operate without wheat flour, without dairy products, without beef, without pork, and without cane sugar.
When you think about a standard Western restaurant, removing those 5 ingredients essentially eliminates 90% of the standard menu.
Oh, easily.
So what are they actually cooking?
When you remove those colonial staples, what you are left with is a stunningly rich, diverse palette of hyperlocal, pre-colonial foods.
Like what?
They center regional plants, sustainably harvested game, native berries, Haudenosaunee corn, wild rice, mesquite, bison, and indigenous legumes.
And the researchers are quick to point out a crucial nuance here. This is not a historical reenactment. These chefs are not treating their kitchens like museums, trying to freeze indigenous food precisely in the year 1491.
No, not at all. That is a common misunderstanding.
Right.
These chefs combine traditional, ancestral ingredients and deep ecological knowledge with highly contemporary, advanced culinary techniques. They are proving that indigenous cuisine is a living, breathing entity.
It's modern.
It is highly innovative and entirely future-oriented. And importantly, from an economic standpoint, by intentionally purchasing their ingredients from indigenous producers, foragers, and farmers, they are keeping the wealth generated by the food system firmly under community control.
Building their own supply chain.
They're building a sovereign supply chain.
But this culinary revival is also fighting a massive battle of perception, particularly regarding language and how food is represented in the media. The texts dive deep into the linguistic colonization of food, which I found absolutely fascinating. Let's talk about the word curry.
The impact of language on our perception of value cannot be overstated. During British colonial rule in India, the empire encountered a vast subcontinent with thousands of highly distinct, complex regional dishes, varied spice blends, and diverse culinary traditions.
Right.
But instead of acknowledging that complexity, the British effectively flattened it all into a single, commercialized, easily digestible category: curry.
It is a linguistic shorthand that completely erases the actual culture and the nuance of the cuisine.
It is an act of culinary simplification designed entirely for the convenience and comfort of the colonizer. And the research shows how we see this exact dynamic play out today, constantly, in online restaurant reviews and mainstream food media.
How does that look today?
Studies analyzing linguistic patterns in reviews reveal a deep systemic bias. Immigrant cuisines, particularly from Asia, Africa, or Latin America, are routinely stigmatized.
In what way?
The reviews consistently expect them to be cheap, exotic, spicy, or fast. If an immigrant restaurant charges $30 for a highly complex, labor-intensive dish, reviewers often express outrage.
Meanwhile, European cuisines like French or Italian are universally elevated as refined, sophisticated, and naturally worthy of premium high-end prices for essentially pasta and sauce.
Exactly. The language dictates the economic value assigned to the culture. Which brings us to a very complex, often heated debate outlined in the text: the line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation.
This is a big one.
Because I think people hear a phrase like decolonizing food, and they immediately worry it means they are never allowed to cook a recipe from another culture again, or that culinary boundaries must be rigidly enforced.
Right. It triggers a defensive reaction. People think, does this mean I can't make tacos if I'm not Mexican?
The scholars and chefs driving this movement are very clear on this distinction. Decolonial criticism absolutely does not forbid cultural exchange.
Good to clarify.
Human cultures have always traded ingredients, shared techniques, and influenced each other's cuisines. The central issue is not the sharing itself. The issue revolves entirely around power dynamics, credit, and profit.
I see this constantly in food media and on social media. An influencer or a mainstream food magazine will post about a trendy new discovery. Maybe it's a new superfood, an ancient grain, or a hack for making a specific type of broth.
Yeah, a new hack.
And there is this profound, often painful irony, because this new discovery has usually been a foundational, everyday staple for an indigenous or marginalized community for centuries or even millennia.
Right.
Yet the viral credit, the huge brand deals, and the financial profit all go to the outsider who rebranded it for a white audience.
That is the textbook definition of appropriation. Exploitation happens when members of dominant, well-resourced groups discover traditional foods, strip them of their cultural origins and context, rename them to make them more marketable, and profit wildly.
While the originators get nothing.
All while the originating communities who preserve that knowledge remain economically marginalized and invisible.
So how do we shift from appropriation to true appreciation?
True appreciation requires a relinquishing of ego and a shifting of authority. It requires acknowledgement, fair compensation, and respect.
Okay, practical steps.
Food media, publishers, and individual consumers can reduce harm by doing the necessary research into culinary history. Name dishes accurately by their original names.
Right.
And most importantly, ensure that the experts, the chefs, and the elders from the originating communities are the ones receiving the platforms, the publishing deals, and the financial profits. If you love a culture's food, you must support the people of that culture.
So what does this all mean as we pull these diverse threads together? We have covered a huge amount of ground today, moving from the philosophical definition of sovereignty to the legal battles over wild rice, to the complex history of provision grounds, and all the way to modern restaurant menus.
It's all connected.
I think the core takeaway is seeing how decolonizing the food system is fundamentally about dismantling the rigid historical structures that violently separated people from their traditional knowledge and their ancestral lands.
Right.
It is about understanding that a truly sovereign food system is not simply defined by what happens to be sitting on the plate in front of you. It is defined by who holds the legal deed to the land it was grown on, whose agricultural science is respected and funded, and ultimately, who is reaping the economic benefits of the harvest.
And if we connect these global, systemic, historical themes back to you, the listener, it invites a much deeper level of critical thinking in your daily life.
How so?
It transforms a simple trip to the grocery store into an exercise in awareness. It encourages you to ask hard questions about the origins of your groceries. When you walk down the aisle, look past the marketing labels, look at the supply chains.
Right.
When you choose a restaurant, look at who owns it, where they source their ingredients, and how they treat the culinary history they are serving. Supporting food sovereignty doesn't always require a grand, dramatic gesture.
It can be everyday choices.
It can be as direct as intentionally supporting local marginalized producers, participating in community agriculture, or simply changing the language and assumptions you use when discussing global cuisines.
It fundamentally changes how you look at the world and your place in it. And to leave you with a final thought to mull over, the research emphasizes time and again that food sovereignty is not just about correcting the past. It is ultimately, profoundly, about preparing for future generations.
Right.
We started this deep dive by having you look at your pantry today, imagining how the locks to the food system were changed in the past, forcing dependence. But I want you to project that forward.
Into the future.
Think about the distant future. If the food currently sitting on your shelves carries the heavy, often hidden history of who controlled the land in the past, what specific, inescapable legacy is our current, highly industrialized global food system baking into the soil for your descendants a century from now?
That's the real question.
Are we continuing to plant the seeds of dependence and ecological fragility, or are we finally taking the necessary steps to return the keys?
A vital, necessary question to carry forward into our daily lives.
Thanks for diving deep with us.